Sure how many we have, but it seems like a great group, so terrific. I have been on a book tour for 3 years. I've spoken in 150 museums around the country, and art museums and galleries. And I usually speak on "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," the famous poem, because I spent 10 years of my life working on this book, which is an art history book about the poem. And it celebrated its 200th anniversary in 2022 and 2023. Written in 1822, but published in 1823. And last year I was able to nominate Clement Clarke Moore into the New York Writers Hall of Fame. A little bit late, but they accepted my nomination, and so we inducted him. And I got the mayor of the city of New York to declare it Clement Clarke Moore Day. And we had a party in Manhattan with Santa and elves, but also 30 members of the Moore family, including Clement Clarke Moore VI. So it was very fun and very rewarding, and I also helped the Bidens decorate the White House in the theme of "'Twas" last year, and I have a letter from Joe Biden on my desk thanking me. So that was 10 years of work, which had lots of really thrilling moments for me and great excitement. How I came to this, a lot of people always ask me, how did you get involved in Christmas, besides loving Christmas my whole life? I published this edition of the poem in 2012, and the reason I did this was that I was working with the University of Southern California on smoke-free movies. It was a push to try and get a disclaimer on films that depicted smoking to protect children, like we do with sexual images and other things that we warn. So we were trying to do smoke-free movies, and people were laughing at us saying that'll never happen. And I came up with the idea of doing something, because I was a publisher in the world of publishing, to promote this concept and just to bring attention to the fact that we still need to protect children from predatory industries like tobacco. And so I took the pipe out of Santa, and Stephen Colbert did a spoof on me, and Barbara Walters on The View got involved, and NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams at that time, and it went around the world. It was being talked about in China and India, ended up in the New York Post and Vanity Fair and in every major outlet in America. So it was a very big story, and it gave me as a platform I wanted to talk about tobacco and prevention through taking Santa Claus, the most influential character of all time, and turning him into a smoke-free character. Ended up at the United Nations in Vienna and in New York speaking about it. And so it's really an accomplishment of my life to have done this, and it could have gone nowhere. It was a simple little idea, but it hit the right accord, and the right people, including Stephen Colbert, helped me immensely to take that around the world. So I spent all this time working on "'Twas" and Santa Claus, and in my travels and in my research over 10 years, 15 years when you talk about "'Twas", I kept bumping into Mrs. Claus. And I thought, well, this is interesting, because when I think of Mrs. Claus, like I want you to do this with me, when you think of Mrs. Claus, who comes to mind?
Santa.
What does she look like? Who is she to you?
She looks like
Who she look like? Large.
Edith from
Oh, she
Edith
does
Bunker.
not. She does not.
Oh, all the family.
Okay. So lots of people would say grandmotherly. Makes cookies. She's probably the most famous cookie maker in the world. But there's such a rich history of Mrs. Claus that starts in 1849 that I thought, well, I'm going to go back, because no one's ever done a history of her. I'm going to go back and I'm going to look at the literature and the art, and I'm going to put her story together for her and find out who she really is, and what authors and artists came to her and developed her. And so I started writing this book, which I'm publishing. It'll be out next Christmas, and I'll have some copies. I'll make sure you have a few. But it was an incredible journey to go on, because what I discovered was a woman who is not only the kindred spirit of Santa Claus, but has magical powers and all of that, but she also has an incredible role in feminism and in the female suffragette movement and getting the vote for women. And so that really intrigued me, how she was so involved in that, and then how she progressed. So maybe we'll have another slide.
All right.
So this is me. work. Okay,
In
then- and then-
1822.
Yeah, that's,
Aged very well.
so this is just me working on my book. Okay, and the next slide, yeah. We'll go through some of these quickly. So Mrs. Claus.
There she is.
So this is the title of my new book. I just found this character in 1849. She comes along, and in 1849, she's written up in a story as a disguised woman who's been, who ran away from home, and it's a fable about forgiveness and redemption. And she and her husband appear in the wintry night at the door of their family in disguise. And she's an old woman, and he's an old man. And they come in and they're given shelter. This poor family says, come on, you must come in, we'll share what we have. It's Christmas Eve, we'll give you what we have. And in the night, they get up and they're wealthy. She's married a wealthy man, and they have all these presents, and she bestows the family, and she says, it's me, right? So it's this lovely story. But she's a disguised character at the very beginning in 1849. So that was the very first reference I could find of her. And what's so intriguing about that story is that both Santa Claus and Mrs. Claus are built from this concept of St. Nicholas and the concept of anonymous giving, thoughtlessness, like just absolute selflessness, gratitude, charity, great Christian values. And that first fable is very much about those values. Okay, then we'll have the next slide. So this is, as I said, we all have sort of an image of this woman, and Mrs. Claus, has been so many different things that I thought, well, when I approach this, I wonder if her story is sort of a linear development, right? She sort of develops over time, but that's not all the case. Mrs. Claus has so many different personifications and characterizations that it's as though anybody who ever wrote about Mrs. Claus had never written or read anybody else's work. She has at least 100 names, from Ruth to Jessie, to Nancy, to Polly, to Mary, to Carol. The names, it's fascinating to me that people didn't reference earlier work. Her appearance too, she's everywhere from a young ingenue with extremely beautiful long gowns and jewels in 1868, and beautiful long hair and just really something, to 1950s, to the old grandmother style, to, Joan Crawford dressed up as Mrs. Claus with the shortest of short skirts you could imagine, when she was 24 years old, posing as a starlet for a movie promo. Shirley Temple, Carol Lombard, and it just goes on and on and on. The way that people come to her, and they seem to think that they're the first person to have ever come across her. I found a variation of her. So the idea of a developmental book, me writing the story of the development of her, was completely out the window. Because it's not at all how she's been presented. I found that really, really interesting. You can find characters that we all know and love, like Alice in Wonderland, and we have a very clear picture of who that character is. Even the blue dress, the white apron, like, you can get her into focus pretty quickly. Mary Poppins, these characters are very defined, and it's usually by one seminal work. Mrs. Claus comes through history and literature in dozens of stories and many, many images, so it's not really a clear sort of one story that sort of nails her, which I found really, really interesting. And as I said, it's as though the people who wrote about her between 1849 and 1970 had never read anybody else's work. So I don't know how that all happened, but okay, what's our next one? Oh.
Is it okay to take pictures of your
Sure. So as I mentioned, she comes in disguise in 1849. The first time we ever see her named as Mrs. Santa Claus is in the Yale Yale University magazine, and she is described as Mrs. Santa Claus. So she's actually dated 1851, and then therefore from New England, from Manhattan, like Santa Claus. She appears on the stage for the very first time, this is really fascinating, in 1854, up in Utica, New York, at the Utica Insane Asylum. And what was really interesting was I thought, okay, the first theatrical performance of Mrs. Claus, where she performs as a mother with a baby, is at the insane asylum. And I wasn't sure what that was all about. And so I spent some time and I went looking and I researched what that was about, and that in the 1850s, people would tour the insane asylums, they would go to theatrical productions, they would tour the grounds, because there was a whole new field of psychology that believed that people who were challenged mentally, with mental illness, would do well with the arts and creativity and kindness and beauty. And they built these beautiful asylums, and they had beautiful gardens, and they had beautiful art, and they encouraged tourism. And so they'd have dances, they'd have plays, and it was very popular in England and in America. And there was a whole new way of approaching mental health. So I thought that was really, really interesting. Prior to that, people would visit asylums, and it was a tourism industry, was to visit asylums, but it was to see the freaks, and they would pay to see people chained up and everything else. So it really turns in 1850, this whole new way. And a lot of the people who funded these asylums were, sadly to say, women who were of wealth, but whose husbands had placed them there because they didn't want to be married any longer. And so these women weren't mentally ill, and they were wealthy, and they had a family, and they were able to fund these beautiful buildings and galleries and gardens. So really fascinating stuff. You could actually buy tourism magazines and books on how to tour asylums. It's a whole tourism industry. But when I first saw this, I thought, well, that's kind of callous and awful. But actually, no. It was right in the philosophy of these people need stimulus and the arts to survive and to thrive. So really stuff. So they wrote the first play of Mrs. Claus, the impatients, the people who were there. Okay. So then the presenter. So we've got her in literature, named on stage, and then as a presenter. And the first time we ever see Mrs. Claus show up in a costume to be Mrs. Claus in front of children as a personification of her is in 1899 in Cambridge, Ohio. I can't find anything earlier. I found this in a newspaper, and it's about the story of a young woman. She's at the Sunday school class. She shows up dressed as Mrs. Claus, and she says, I'm here this evening or this afternoon because Santa's very busy, he couldn't come. I'm here, I have all the magical powers he has, I can grant you your wishes. And she hands out candies and toys, and then she proceeds to turn and break open a large pumpkin and a child jumps out. So, all quite fun and magical. So I phoned the Ohio newspaper, the Daily Jefferson, where it was published, and I said, I'm coming to Cambridge for the Dickens Festival, and do you know about this? And they said, no, what paper was it? I said, it was in yours in 1899. And so just like today in your paper, they put me on the front cover. So Ohio can claim her as the first presenter. Today there are thousands of people who present as Mrs. Claus. They appear in parades and in stores. They do incredible work as far as charity. I've met possibly 2,000 of them since January. I've been at 6 Santa Claus conventions. And I'm a Canadian, I was going to the American border one day, and he said, what are you doing? I said, I'm going to a Santa Claus convention. He said, in July? And I went, yes, I am. And he said, that's really interesting. I said, well, they do great work all year long. These people who are Santa Claus that you see at Christmas, they are professionals, but they're also an incredible fraternity and sorority of women who do great charitable work. So they see children in hospitals and home visits, and they go to retirement homes, and they raise money, and they support each other, and it's really quite the community of Christmas and Clauses that's out there. So the presenter role is something that they really, really try to encourage women to come to. And today I've met Mrs. Clauses who are all different ages, but also come from backgrounds of grief counseling, from tourism, from catering, from education, from medical, from first responders to, there's just a wide, wide range. So if any of you feel the urge to be Mrs. Claus, are you Mrs. Claus?
No, but I just wondered, is Mrs. Claus always white, Caucasian?
No, she's not. We'll get to that too, yeah. So it's just this great big world that she's created. Okay. So let's just go back for a minute here, just because I think it's important to put it all in context. So as we've said, Mrs. Claus comes along in 1849, and this is the first Christmas tree that we believe this is about the same right time. There are possibly some Hessian soldiers during the American Revolution who put up Christmas trees, being German, but this is really considered to be the first Christmas tree. Christmas gets going in America in 1822 with Clement Clark Moore in a very big way. The fact that he is the one who really put Santa Claus on the roof with reindeers is really the person who is credited with creating Christmas. Prior to him was Washington Irving of 1809, and he has St. Nicholas flying around the skies of Manhattan, but it's really Clement Clark Moore and this poem. Charles Dickens comes along with Christmas Carol in 1843, so just to put these in context, and so then we've got Mrs. Claus 1849, so that's sort of the era of it all. But there's still, it's very much still a Christmas at home, it's very subtle, it's not a big deal, and nothing really gets going until after the American Civil War, as far as Christmas in America. Okay, we can talk about that more too if you want to ask me questions after. Okay. Okay, so we've got ourselves up to 1850, as I mentioned. The suffragette movement gets going in America around this time with different publications, and what's totally fascinating is that Mrs. Claus gets involved really early in the suffragette movement. She is involved in all kinds of stories that I found in Harper's and in Gaudie's Ladies Magazine and other periodicals about her disgruntled nature, that she's very upset that she doesn't get to ride the sleigh, she doesn't get any applause, loving, charitable being. And for all the antics and all the things that go on with her, this is what she's really all about. And this woman was a food manager, I believe, and she's started out and become quite a star in Canada. She lives in Ontario and does a lot of charitable work, so yeah, that's her. But there are Mrs. Clauses in every single state, and they have meetings and they have memberships and they have clubs, and they all year long they meet every month, and they just see how many people they can help in the world, and to keep the spirit of Christmas alive and what it's all about. And they do a lot of professional trainings too, as far as how to deal with special needs children or how to deal with difficult conversations. Sometimes people will tell things to Mrs. Claus they don't tell to anybody else. So there's a lot of responsibility to it too. But anyway, it's my great pleasure to meet some of these people. Okay. So that is me. So I want to take questions from anybody who has questions about Mrs. Claus and anything about Christmas in general. I'm very happy to speak about it. Also, 'twas the night before Christmas. So do you have any questions? Hopefully you do.
Well, I have a question in general about Santa Claus and Mrs. Claus.
Yes.
You mentioned the Christian values, and I'm wondering if does that story resonate with non-Christian cultures?
Yes, it does. And the concept of Santa Claus and Mrs. Claus are under the established clause of the American Constitution. They are allowed in public spaces and in libraries and schools and government buildings because they have this ability to straddle both worlds. So they can straddle the Christian world, but also the pagan magical world. And so in the 1980s, they came under challenge, and it went to the Supreme Court to decide if they were allowed in public buildings or in public spaces. And the Supreme Court ruled that yes, they were, because they come from a history that's thousands of years old and over 200 years old in America. And because they have this magical quality of straddling both worlds, that they're allowed. They're not only allowed, they're encouraged, because if you have Mrs. Claus or Santa Claus or a Christmas tree in a public building, you can then have your manger. If you don't have the Christmas tree or Mrs. Claus or Santa Claus, you can't. But there are some challenges to that under the freedom of rights of religious expression, that you could have the manger, but you can be challenged, and it's tough, and they've gone to court. But since the 1980s, this has been the rule with the Establishment Clause, and it's wonderful, because these are the values that are celebrated by all kinds of cultures. And mean, Twas Night for Christmas has been translated into every major language, including Yiddish, by NPR. So they do straddle both worlds. But they do have roots in Christianity in St. Nicholas. Because St. Nicholas is the patron saint of children, but his legendary act of throwing gold balls through the window of a home where women were going to be sold to slavery because they didn't have money to buy themselves into marriage. That's the whole story that gets this whole thing going. So you have St. Nicholas showing up and throwing gold in anonymously at night because he doesn't want any gratitude for it or acknowledgement. It's exactly what Santa Claus is doing, right? So it is Christian at heart, but it's so exceeds that.
And you can find more about that at Michael Ferry's talk on December 6th, I think.
8th, Sunday, December 8th,
At the Coopville Library at
at 2 p.m.
2 p.m.
But it always surprises me when I hear someone say that you can't have Santa Claus on the windows of a school, and it's completely wrong. You actually can under the American Constitution. And I had some really fun experiences with this because we've lived through an interesting age, you know, of some of these things being challenged, and in the last few years, and I was doing a presentation at the Berkshire Museum in Massachusetts, and they called me and said, we need you to come and get all your books, and I said, why? And they said, because we can't have anything Christian in our bookstore. And I had to sort of politely say, if you start banning elves, you have a really big problem. We don't ban elves. He's an elf. He is an elf. The story, he's a little tiny elf guy, right? Who's magically flying around with some reindeer, right? You know. But the funniest one of all, which I love telling, happened last year. I'm touring California at the end of this month, December, and I was trying to get into Yosemite because Yosemite has the Washington Irving dinner, and that Ansel Adams started, and they do this play with Washington Irving. It's a big theatrical thing. And I wanted to have my books there because I'm a big fan of Washington Irving. And so I submitted my books to the gift shop in Yosemite National Park because I wanted to go to the gift shop and I wanted to sign my books. And they said, well, we'll have to review your books. And I go, well, that's fine. And so I waited and waited, and then I finally got a phone call back, and I said, no, I phoned them, and I said, how are you doing? And so, well, we haven't done it yet. I said, well, what are you looking for? I mean, it's Twas Night for Christmas, how hard could this be, right? And they said, well, there can't be any animals in clothing. And I said, pardon? And they said, there can't be any animals in clothing because it's offensive to the bears in the park. And I just went, I can't believe this. In this day and age, I'm defending my mice who are in pajamas. So, you know, so
Wait a minute, wait a
Wait.
minute. What did you say?
they wouldn't let me have my books in the
How
store
did they know the bears were offended?
because they're crazy people.
And this was the person in the
And so I wasn't allowed
bookstore?
to attend
or the-
the Washington Irving's Yosemite dinner party because my book has animals in clothes.
And this decision was made
The
by,
buyer for the
Smoking
Yosemite
the bear
National
wears
Park.
pants.
And a hat.
And all the sports mascots, like all the sports
well, I'm
teams
just
have.
curious, who actually made the
The woman who's
decision?
head of the buying department of the Yosemite National Park
Oh,
bookstore.
okay.
So I didn't get to go. But anyway, so I'm very happy to defend Christmas, because Christmas now, it means so much more, and it's so many more people are involved in it, and it's very inclusive
Did you
of everyone.
try going above her?
No, I didn't. You know what I did say to her though? I didn't lose it. I said simply, I said,
Okay.
I'm absolutely fascinated by what you just said. I want you to tell me the rest of your regulations because I'm really interested. And then I called my friend who's head of Columbia University's Alumni Association. I told her and she killed herself. Yes.
So, this has just been fascinating. Thank you so much. My question is, have you ever dressed up as Mrs. Claus
Yes.
for any events or presentations or anything like that?
Well, I haven't, but I've been collecting, you're gonna love this, I've been collecting a Mrs. Claus costume Mrs. Claus Halloween. So it's Mrs. Claus, but then it's got this Halloween thing going on. It's really funny.
Okay,
But I haven't worn it yet.
okay.
But it's stellar. It's got these big spider earrings with a big silver hat and then the Mrs. Claus holly out. It's great. It's great.
You're gonna get in
So
trouble
I'm
for
not-
that.
I'm not familiar with the Goody story.
Oh, goody, yes.
Yeah, could you
I was gonna read it tonight, but it's quite obscure and it's kind of, yeah. So Goody is a story about Mrs. Claus. Again, Santa Claus has had something, it's sort of the standard thing where Santa Claus has either bumped his head, broken his leg, or is sick, or too grumpy or depressed to go out. And so Mrs. Claus has to come into it and go, okay, well, I'll go. But in Goody, she goes out and it's about a 2-page poem. But it's a poem that kind of asserts herself, but it's nowhere near as good as some of the other stuff. I mean, the best ones are the 1860s, by far. There's 5 or 6 of them that I've got in my book, that are goodies in my book too, but those are my very favorite ones, where they're just, she's just this lovely spirited character who just goes, I'll go, let me do it, not sort of, But I have this thing where Reese Witherspoon, the film producer right now, is producing Mrs. Claus with Jennifer Garner for next Christmas. And I really want them to write it so that she is an empowered 21st century woman who has a voice. Because it's unfortunate, because some of the things I've seen even in recent years, she's this disgruntled, jealous, sort of, sort of battling and sort of, and it's so old. And I think that as a woman, and I'm 66 years old, so having gone through the whole feminist movement of the 70s, I really think we found our voice. I really hope we have. And that we can say what we need and assert ourselves in a lovely way without, lambasting our husbands and keeping a bad list. I think that we've moved on and we need her to be there like she was in 1860. She was more empowered in 1860 than she is through many of these other stories.
Wow.
We need to get her back to the role model of an empowered woman who has a voice, who's appreciated. And in those early stories, Santa does say things like, I couldn't do it without you. It's a really loving relationship. And I think she also the two of them together, if Reese Witherspoon does this properly, she can do it where they're not only a role model of a woman who's found her voice, but of marriage and partnership and teamwork and equality of effort versus, I need my, I want mine, he gets his, I want, I think that's just, and I think that needs to go the way of the dustbin. But I think also the naughty or nice, and I'm always talking to Santa Clauses. I've met 3,000 of them this year. I've spoken at 6 of their conventions in front of hundreds of them. And they've all got their naughty or nice, gadgets, and I go, no. This poem in 1822 took out the naughty or nice. This poem has survived 201 years because it's benevolent and kind, and everybody gets something. It's jolly, it's fun. No one's being threatened with being beaten up. No one's being threatened with naughty or niceness. No creepy elves spying on anybody. This would not have survived. And the First Lady of the United States has read this on the steps of the White House every year since 1953. And I do not believe in a million years that Michelle Obama would have read this if it had a threat of punishing people with being beaten up by a stick. And everything that came before this had St. Nicholas come in with a birchen rod or a sidekick who had a stick or a sack that was going to throw you and kill you. So this made it benevolent and kind and very Christian because it's non-judgmental. And it's an important concept in Christianity. I'm not sort of on this big, I don't want to get too religious here, but it's a core concept of non-judgment. You are unto yourself, we're not here to judge you. And that's really important about Twas. And so I'm always talking to Santas about let's knock the naughty or nice thing off the list. We don't do that anymore. Children self-regulate. I really believe that. I have a little granddaughter who's here. She's just turned 3. She knows very well if she's done something that's a bit, right? You just can tell her face, right? We don't need naughty or nice. We don't need people, reporting on them and keeping lists. There was a thing where Santa Claus, I met a Santa Claus and we were talking about this, and he said he had a little boy sitting on his lap, and he said to him, have you been naughty or nice this year? The kid had a complete meltdown, freaked out, screaming, didn't know, right? They turned to his mom and said, I don't know, Mom, have I been good?
Probably
And I went, knock it off.
Yeah.
We don't need to do the naughty or nice thing. And I think it's sometimes cute because it's in songs or it's in a poem.
Yeah.
But I think the naughty or nice, and Mrs. Claus has sometimes been, they've said, oh, well, she's the keeper of the naughty list. But I've talked to Mrs. Claus about this. And the really good ones will say, there is no such thing as a naughty or nice. There's a nice list. And then all we ask is that you try. Are you trying to be good? Great, you get a present, you know? But the naughty or nice needs to go away. And so I think that we can evolve her a little bit with the right people helping.
Along those lines, that's why I love the old version of Miracle on 31st Street, where he speaks to the children in their language, right?
Right.
And he signs with the child that's deaf.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful thing. And the question again, so where's this whole lump of coal thing come into the...
Well, it's coming back from the pre-1822 stuff with the sidekick, the Sinterklaasers, all the different St. Nicholas characters through all these different cultures who would come with a negative character, who punished, and some of them are really creepy. And there's lots of women characters too, right? Women characters too, back in history before these characters. Mrs. Claus is an American, okay? She's an American creation. There were no German chocolate molds of Mrs. Claus, right? So she's American. She's from Philadelphia, 1849, or Cambridge, 1899, or Yale, which I think Yale because they call her Mrs. Claus. So I would give it to New England. But yeah, so she has a real role to play, and I hope that she really can shine on because she is such a great role model.
So I thought you might all like to see this. This just came out. This is a British commercial. Any Bridgerton fans will recognize the main character of this commercial.
Yes.
I'm not going to play the sound because it won't work very well with our system, but I think you can get a feel for what's going on here. This is just a minute.
Yeah.
This is Mrs. Claus 2024.
Yeah. This is her ad. And she's saying here, I've watched this, she says, I just wanted to be fabulous, right? And then at the end she says, and you thought it was all him. So again, it's that still there a little bit, right? You thought it was all him. So yeah, it's a makeup at the North Pole workshops. And there's 3 or 4 of these. Marks and Spencer's did one, and Mercedes-Benz, and she's in a helicopter on a snowmobile, and she's very, very modern and very great. Especially the Marks and Spencer ones, because she and Santa have this real love thing going on. If you ever have a chance, they're called mini movies now, especially in Britain. They have these mini commercials. They're really, I'm proud of them. Coca-Cola ran a campaign last year called Find Your Inner Santa. That was their campaign. Channel your inner Santa. And so I wrote them saying, how about we channel our Mrs. Santa? We've never ever had a Mrs. Santa in a Coke ad. Could we, maybe, right?
Yeah, it's time.
Yeah.